It was not 2 women, but 8, who were executed during the reign of the man England called King Henry VIII, a monarch with 6 wives, who left behind a legacy, not of glory and law, but of blood and fear. When people speak of him, they remember the scandals of his divorces, the creation of the Church of England, so that he could remarry, and the cold morning when Anne Boleyn, his second wife, was beheaded by sword inside the Tower of London. But Anne was not alone. There was Catherine Howard, Elizabeth Barton, Margaret Pole, Anne Askew, Margaret Davy, Alice Wolfe, and Jane Boleyn, 8 women who were burned, hanged, boiled, and beheaded until their bodies could no longer be recognized, buried in haste, and forgotten. They did not die because of the law. They died because of the mood swings of a king terrified of losing power, terrified of betrayal, terrified of women who dared to speak their own truth. They died for courage, for faith, for being caught in the web of politics, or simply because they displeased the king's eye. Henry VIII was not merely a man with many wives. He was the symbol of limitless authority, a power that could rewrite the law in a single night, that could turn a maid into a queen, and a queen into a criminal in less than a week. And for women, that power was a nightmare, because no one could predict what would make the king smile or rage. One day, you might wear velvet, sit beside the throne, and see the entire court kneel before you. But a week later, you might be locked in a cell with no window, forced to listen to the cries of prisoners below, and forced to learn how to kneel and place your neck upon the block, or be plunged into boiling water until your skin tore apart in layers. Every woman who died in that reign carried her own story, but all shared the same fate. They had challenged the fear inside the king, and the price for that defiance was death. Margaret Davy was only a servant, accused of poisoning her mistress, an accusation that needed no evidence, only suspicion, and a new law written by Henry himself that anyone who used poison would be deemed a traitor and boiled alive. And so she was thrown into an iron cauldron in Smithfield, before a crowd of hundreds, her screams, according to witnesses, so unbearable that pregnant women fainted where they stood. Then there was Elizabeth Barton, the holy nun who claimed visions from God, and who was hanged, beheaded, and had her head displayed on London Bridge simply because she had said that if the king married Anne Boleyn, he would die within a month. Anne Askew, the only woman ever tortured on the rack in the Tower of London, was burned alive while seated on a chair, her body too broken to stand, tied in chains and burned slowly for over an hour, because she dared to read the English Bible to the poor. Margaret Pole, the last Countess of the House of York, was 67 years old when an inexperienced executioner hacked at her neck and shoulders more than 10 times, killing her without trial. Because she was the mother of Reginald Pole, a Catholic cardinal who defied the king. Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn, Jane Boleyn. Women bound by blood or marriage to the throne met their ends when the king needed a reason to love another. And Alice Wolfe, accused of stealing gold from the royal treasury, was chained to a stone wall and drowned slowly by the rising tide alongside her lover. Never tried, never forgiven. None of them had proper graves. None received justice. None were remembered in the classrooms of England. But they existed. They were witnesses to a kingdom built on blood and silence, where death could come for a word spoken wrong, a glance held too long, or a love that should never have been. And the most terrifying thing is that their deaths shocked no one. England had grown numb to silence. The death of a woman meant little beside the birth of an heir. The survival of a queen meant less than the king's desire for another wife. These women, they were not only victims of Henry, but victims of a society that had forgotten how to listen. This series will tell their stories: the last nights, the final breaths, the muffled screams, the names erased from the record, and take you through a journey where sleep itself becomes a memorial to the forgotten. This is not a story of history. It is a story of broken dreams. And perhaps, by the time you reach the end of all 9 chapters, you will understand why they say, the Tudor dynasty did not end in blood, it began in blood. And that blood belonged to the women who dared not bow. There are many ways to die beneath a crown, but some are so brutal, they do not fit neatly into books or ballads. Some are not whispered in churchyards or sung in taverns. Some are not even remembered as the deaths of people, but as punishments crafted to terrify the masses, to send a message louder than any drum or trumpet. Margaret Davy was not a queen, not a noblewoman, not a person of influence or danger. She was a maid, a servant in someone else's house, a girl who prepared meals, fetched water, obeyed without question, and faded into the corners of other people's stories. But one day in the year 1542, her name became the headline in a law passed by the king himself. A law that did not just sentence her to die, but sentenced her to be boiled alive, slowly and publicly, inside a cauldron placed in the middle of Smithfield, where markets once bustled and meat was once sold. The square became a place of steam and horror. And Margaret Davy, by all accounts, became a warning. She was accused of poison, which in Henry's reign was no longer just a crime, but high treason. To poison someone, the king declared, was more dangerous than a sword or a dagger, because it bypassed the natural defenses of the body and spirit. It crept in quietly, unseen, swallowed in good faith, and only revealed itself when it was too late. And so, the king demanded a punishment just as unnatural, just as insidious. He signed a new law into being that poisoners should not be hanged, or beheaded, or burned, but boiled. Their skin would peel, their lungs would scream, their flesh would blister and erupt, and the people would gather to see it, to remember it, and never dare do the same. Margaret Davy's crime was said to be the poisoning of her mistress, and possibly others in the same household. Though no names were officially recorded, no priest was summoned to confirm guilt. No family was brought forward to plead mercy. Her trial, if it ever happened, did not last long enough to leave a trace. What remains is the record of her sentence, and the date it was carried out. She was taken to Smithfield on the 17th of March, bound, trembling, and walked in front of a crowd who had come not to mourn, but to stare. For boiling alive was a novelty, a new horror, and Henry knew that public fear could be as sharp as any sword. The cauldron had been filled with water and set to boil for hours before her arrival. Witnesses described it as a great pot placed on an iron frame above roaring firewood, with chains dangling from a hook above it. She would not be dropped in and left to vanish. She would be lowered, slowly, carefully, and raised again between stages, so that death came not with a single act, but as a sequence of agonies. And so she was. 3 times they dipped her in, and each time she screamed louder than the last. Her cries echoed against the stone buildings, and the chroniclers who stood nearby wrote that women fainted, that men turned their faces away, and that one old merchant vomited into his own cloak, yet no one stopped it. No priest raised a hand. No judge stepped forward. No royal guard brought a reprieve. Henry was not there. Of course, he never watched the things he ordered, But he did ensure that it was written down that this young woman had died not for hatred or envy, but for daring to violate the natural order with something as cowardly and invisible as poison, in a kingdom where kings could not trust their own meals, where testers tasted every dish before the monarch lifted his fork, where the fear of betrayal seeped into every spoonful of stew or cup of ale. Margaret's death was meant to say, "We see you. And if you dare to betray, we will make sure the fire sees you too." And when it was over, if it can ever truly be said to have been over, her body was removed from the water. No longer a body at all, but something else. Something too soft, too pink, too open to describe. She was buried in secret, likely without ceremony, likely in a mass grave beneath the city she had served. No stone was placed for her. No last words were recorded. No mourning family is remembered. But her name remained in one place, the statute books, under the ruling of Henry VIII, who wrote into law that her kind of death was the only death fitting for traitors who used poison. And for many years afterward, no one else was boiled. It was as if her death had been enough. But that silenced the fact that hers was the last does not mean it was forgotten. It means it worked. The law was never needed again. Because no one dared be the next Margaret Davy. And that may have been the greatest cruelty of all, not just to die, but to die in such a way that others feared your pain more than they remembered your name. She might have been innocent. She might have been desperate. She might have been framed. Or she might have committed the act in some moment of heartbreak or rebellion or despair. But none of that mattered when the fires were lit and the pot was placed. Margaret's story, if it can be called hers at all, is not about guilt or motive. It is about the sound of flesh and water. The way people look away too late. And the legacy of a king who was so afraid of the invisible that he made pain visible for everyone to see. And tonight, as you lie in the dark, perhaps you'll think of her not with terror, but with a quiet grief. For she was not the last woman to die under Henry's reign, but she was the last to boil. And that, in the world of kings and silence, may be the closest thing to mercy she was ever given. There was once a girl who could barely read her own name, who worked as a servant in the house of a farm manager, who fell ill and began to tremble and speak in strange voices, who claimed that God had placed visions in her soul. And England listened, not laughed, not doubted, but listened, because this girl, barely more than a child, began to speak of death, of kings, of heaven, and of a future no one dared imagine. Her name was Elizabeth Barton. But to the people of Kent, to the monks who watched her eyes roll back in trance, to the crowds who gathered for her sermons, to the bishops who knelt when she passed, she was known only as the Holy Maid. And in another time, in another country, she might have been canonized, crowned in flowers, her name written in stained glass. But in the reign of Henry VIII, there was only one ending for women who said too much. She was hanged, she was beheaded, and her head was spiked on the bridge that carried London's heart. Elizabeth was born around the year 1506, in a village so small it barely had a name, and she worked, like many poor girls did, in kitchens and halls, her fingers red from soap and wood smoke. Her back sore before she was 16. Then came the illness. Some said epilepsy. Others said possession, and she began to convulse, to speak in riddles and warnings, and to predict deaths before they came. A baby, dead before sunrise. A nobleman falling from his horse. A storm that arrived exactly when she said it would. And so the whispers began. That the girl was touched by heaven, that she could see what others could not. that she spoke not her own words, but God's. She became a nun, a quiet one. At first, then a voice, then a symbol. She spoke against heresy, against pride, and against the danger that lurked not in the poor, but in the palaces. And then, one day, she spoke the name. No one was allowed to say Henry. She said that if the king married Anne Boleyn, he would die. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but physically, within a month, and that his soul would rot in hell. For a time, people gasped in awe. They wept. They believed. Because Elizabeth Barton had become more than a woman, she was a prophecy in flesh. She met bishops. She met Cardinal Wolsey. She was summoned to court, stood before the king himself, and spoke her visions without trembling. She told Henry to burn the English Bible, to return to Rome, to leave Anne Boleyn untouched. And Henry, for once, did not roar. He smiled, but behind that smile was the slow tightening of the noose. The king did not strike immediately. He watched. He waited. He let her speak again. Let her travel. Let her tour towns and gather crowds. Let her believe she was safe. And then he moved. The archbishop questioned her. Thomas Cromwell summoned her. And the tower opened its doors. Inside those cold walls, where so many others had waited for death, Elizabeth's voice began to change. She confessed, not in sermons, but in whispers, not to the people, but to the men who pulled the strings of power. She said she had lied, that her visions were madness, that God had never spoken, that she had deceived the kingdom. Was it true? Or was it the voice of someone broken by weeks in a stone cell? By threats? By hunger? By chains? No one knows. But her confession was taken, recorded, and weaponized. And then she was dragged from the tower, not in secret, not in silence, but through the streets of London, past the crowds, who once called her a saint, to St. Paul's Cross, where a platform had been built. There, in front of 2,000 people, she stood and said, "By my falsehood I have deceived all of these people and many more." Her voice did not tremble, but her hands did. And when she finished, the people stared in silence. Some spat, some wept, some simply turned away. But Henry was not done. A law was written, a special bill of treason, not for rebels, not for traitorous lords, but for a nun, she and her so-called conspirators, monks, friars. Priests were sentenced not to exile, not to silence, but to death. And on the 20th of April, in the year 1534, Elizabeth Barton was taken from the tower for the last time. They dragged her on a hurdle through the city, past markets, past children, past the river that once brought pilgrims to her convent. She wore a simple shift, her head uncovered, her feet bare. She did not scream. She did not struggle, but she whispered prayers. And when they reached Tyburn, where the gallows stood in the mud, she looked at the sky and said that she deserved to die, not just for herself, but for the others who would die with her, because she had opened the door, and they had followed her inside. She was hanged, and then beheaded, and then, in a decision as cruel as it was symbolic, her head was placed on a spike and mounted on London Bridge. No other woman had ever been given that fate. It was not honor. It was punishment. A message carved in flesh. That women who spoke against the crown would not simply disappear. They would be displayed. Her body was buried without rites. Her calm dissolved, her writings destroyed. Her name became a warning, but not everyone forgot. Some whispered that her visions had been true, that Henry's death had been delayed, not avoided, that Anne's fate beheaded 3 years later was proof that the Holy Maid had seen clearly. Others said she was mad, others said she was used, but the truth, like so many truths in that reign, drowned beneath power and fear, and so she remains not a martyr to all, not a saint to most, but a shadow on the edge of a king's story. A girl who saw too much, a voice that rose too high, a name that burned too brightly, and was snuffed out too soon. And tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine her not at the gallows, not in chains, not on the spike, but at that moment before it all began, a girl in a dark room, trembling in fever, whispering words she did not yet understand. And outside, England waiting to listen. She was born into the White Rose, into the House of York, when the Wars of the Roses had not yet quieted, and the throne still trembled with each shift of blood and marriage. Her name was Margaret, daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, niece to Edward IV and Richard III, cousin to Elizabeth of York, and through her veins ran not ambition, but survival, for every branch of her family tree had been cut down, burned, buried or drowned in wine long before she understood why people whispered when they passed her cradle. She lived through kings. She lived through queens. She outlasted the fall of one dynasty and the rise of another. And in the end, when she was 67 years old, with white hair and aching joints, and no sword in her hand, she was led to the block, and the boy they sent to kill her did not know how to finish the job. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, mother of the Cardinal, was no longer a threat by the time Henry VIII signed her death warrant. She no longer ruled estates or raised armies or whispered Yorkist claims in noble halls. What she had become was something far more dangerous, a living memory, a relic of a lineage that would not vanish. No matter how many battles were won, she was noble, not by marriage, but by blood. And Henry, who now stood tall beneath the banner of the Tudors, knew that as long as Margaret breathed, his crown could not forget where it came from. She had been raised at court, lost her mother before her 3rd birthday, then her father, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, not by accident, but by the order of his own brother, the king. As a child, she had lived in the shadows of royal households, her inheritance stripped, her name watched, and yet, she survived. She married Sir Richard Pole, a cousin to the new Tudor king, Henry VII, and bore him 5 children. For a time, her life was quiet, ordinary, almost safe. Then came Henry VIII, and with him, the slow unraveling of everything she had built. At first, she rose. She was restored to her father's lands. She was made Countess of Salisbury in her own right. One of the wealthiest peers in the kingdom, she served as governess to Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She kept her faith. She raised her children well. One of them, Reginald, would rise to become a cardinal of the church. But that would be her undoing. When Henry cast aside Catherine and broke with Rome, Margaret remained loyal to the old order. Quietly, firmly, she supported the Queen, and Reginald, bold, brilliant, unafraid, spoke out against the king, warned of tyranny, wrote letters from abroad, calling Henry a destroyer of souls. And Margaret, though she stayed behind in England, bore his name, a name that echoed in the king's mind, like a curse. There is no record of rebellion in her hand. No proof of treason. Only rumors. A tapestry in her house, embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol of Catholic resistance. A letter to her son. A prayer too close to Rome. It was enough. She was arrested in the year 1539 and held in the Tower of London, where she remained for more than 2 years. She was never tried, never allowed to speak in her defense. She was not told the day of her execution until the morning it came, and when they told her, she carved a poem into the wall of her cell, "For traitors on the block should die. I am no traitor. No, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so, towards the block, I shall not go." But they came for her anyway. The scaffold was not ready. The axe was not sharp. The man sent to perform the execution was no master. He hesitated. She knelt, and what followed was not swift. It was a butchery. Some say it took 10 strokes. Others say 12. She turned her head, tried to flee. Her body was hacked. Her shoulders opened. Her back struck again and again. Witnesses wept. One fainted. A woman who had lived through 3 kings died not with dignity, but in pieces, and yet in silence. Henry said nothing. He claimed the countess had plotted against him, that her son had declared war, that the bloodline had to end. But England knew. Even those loyal to the king whispered that it was vengeance, not justice. Margaret's death was not a warning, it was a purge. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls. No grave marker, no eulogy, no tomb. But years later, her son returned. Reginald Pole, the same boy who had once been forced to flee, came back to England under Queen Mary. He stood in the place where his mother had died. He prayed over the place where she had been buried without right. And when the time came, he forgave no one. Today, Margaret Pole is remembered as a Catholic martyr. She was beatified by the Church, her name restored, her death recorded not as a punishment, but as a sacrifice. And still, nearly 500 years later, and she stands in memory as the woman who did not bow, the woman who would not confess, the woman who faced the axe not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. And so tonight, let her memory drift into your dreams, not the screams, not the axe, not the blood, but the image of an old woman standing tall on a scaffold of injustice, lifting her chin beneath the gray morning sky, and saying with every breath she had left, "I am no traitor. No, not I." They were not nobles, nor saints, nor queens. Their names were not embroidered on banners or carved into tombs. They did not hold courts or write letters that shaped the kingdom, but their story hidden beneath layers of stone, behind doors no longer marked, still lingers in the tower's cold breath. A man, a woman, a theft, a tide, and a love that could not swim fast enough. Their names were John Wolfe and Alice Wolfe. Though some say they were never married, and some say they were never truly lovers, only partners in crime, in silence, in drowning. The year was 1534. Gold had gone missing, not a handful of coins, not a purse, but 366 gold crowns, a staggering sum, meant to pay soldiers, to fund ships, to fill the royal treasury. The coins had been sent from Europe, chained inside a chest, locked beneath the deck of a merchant vessel anchored in London's docks. But when the guards returned, the chains were broken, The chest was empty, and the men assigned to guard it were dead. Their bodies had surfaced days later, waterlogged, bruised, eyes open to nothing, and whispers began. About a crewman named John, about a woman seen leaving the docks at night, about the ship's manifest, the changing of the tides, the absence of screams. John Wolfe had worked near the docks for years. He knew the boats. He knew the guards. He knew how long it took a body to float. No one saw him strike the fatal blows. But he was found with money. He was found with maps. He was found with a reason. So they took him, and Alice, the woman he was said to love, followed him to the tower. Every day, she brought bread, wine, blankets. She smiled at the guards, learned their names, lingered too long, and there, behind iron doors, where screams often went unnoticed, she met John Bower, one of the tower wardens, a man with quiet eyes, a tired voice, and a heart that had learned to pretend it could not feel. It began with kindness, then a touch, then a promise, and slowly, the prison door began to soften. John Wolfe received better food, warmer clothes, a key, perhaps a plan, and the walls of the tower, once so firm and final, began to shift like fog. When Wolfe was suddenly released, the case collapsed. The evidence dismissed, Alice stayed behind, smiling, unbothered, confident. But the tower never forgets. New evidence appeared. A letter, a witness, a coin with a royal seal, and worse proof that Alice had been part of it all, that she knew where the gold was hidden, that she had lured the guards to their deaths, that she had used her beauty to blind justice. And so they took her. This time not gently. She was locked in Cold Harbor Tower, the oldest, darkest part of the fortress, where the walls sweated, and no light came but through a barred hole in the wooden door. She was shackled, chained, left to sleep on stone. The guards were told to speak no word to her, but they forgot to warn her heart, because John Bower, the man who once stood on the other side of her door, now stood inside her cell. He brought her scraps, then apples, then poems, scribbled on torn linen, and in the silence of her imprisonment, she began to listen to the sound of his footsteps, like they were songs. He loved her, and the tower, ancient as it was, did not understand love. She told him she could escape, that there was a hidden gate, that she had heard its location from Wolfe, that she needed oil for the hinges, a rope, a key, and Bower, foolish, gentle, and hopeless, gave her everything she asked for. One night, by moonlight, she opened her cell, crept through the halls, climbed the stairs, and met him above Traitor's Gate, where the fog sat low and the ravens had not yet cried. They climbed down, step by careful step. They crossed the moat in a stolen boat. They walked the grass verge barefoot, holding each other's hands, whispering what they would do when they reached France, or Flanders, or any place where the king's shadow could not follow. But then came the guards. Just 3 of them. One with a lantern. One who recognized her. One who raised his hand. Alice was silent. Bower cried out. They were dragged back. This time, the tower made no mistakes. No food. No mercy. John Wolfe, who had fled the country, was caught and brought back in chains. He was not allowed to speak to her. She was not allowed to weep. Instead, they were taken to the lowest cell, the one that flooded at high tide. They were shackled to the wall, wrists high above their heads. The water rose slowly. It always did. It kissed the floor by the first hour, touched their knees by the second. It was said that they tried to climb, that they screamed, that they prayed, but no sound escaped the stone. When the tide reached their mouths, they were still breathing. And when it passed, they were not. No funeral was given. No priest called. Their bodies were buried together. Or perhaps apart, no one knows. But for weeks, John Bower, the guard who had betrayed his king for the sake of a woman's eyes, was kept alive in a place called Little Ease, a cell so small one could neither stand, nor sit, nor lie flat. He confessed everything, without torture, because love had already broken him. They racked him anyway, tore his limbs from their sockets, and in the end, they hung him from the tower wall naked, broken, and alone until the crows took what was left. The gold was never found. Some say it was all a setup, that another man stole the treasure, and Alice was the scapegoat. Some say she was innocent. Others say she killed without blinking. But none of it changes the ending, because in Henry's England, it did not matter who you were, only who you crossed. And once your name was written on the king's list, it did not come off. And so tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine them there, not in chains, not in agony, but on that grassy bank, holding hands, staring at the water and believing, if only for a moment, that they had won. There are stories that burn slowly, not in the telling, but in the living, and some fires do not start in wood, nor end in ash. Some fires begin in paper, in ink, in thought. Some fires are lit by voices, not matches. And for one woman named Anne Askew, the flames began not at the stake, but long before, in the quiet hours when she read a forbidden book and dared to speak what she believed. She was not born a rebel, nor raised to be a martyr. She was born to a knight's family, married off young, taught to kneel and serve, and silence herself. But silence, for Anne, never fell toy, and when the fire came for her, she had already burned away every part of herself that could be frightened. She was born in the year 1521, into a world still clinging to its old gods and its old men. She was clever, sharper than expected, a girl with questions that made priests shift in their seats. She read the Bible not in Latin, but in English, and she did not keep it to herself. She shared it. She preached it, and in doing so, she crossed the first line that could not be uncrossed. Because Henry's England was still deciding what kind of truth it would allow, and Anne had already chosen hers. Her husband hated her for it. He wanted obedience, not scripture. Wanted a wife, not a voice. He cast her out. And Anne, rather than plead or weep, went to London, where she read aloud on street corners and in quiet rooms, spreading the words of a new gospel, one that did not worship relics or indulgences, but God, plainly, directly, without gold or Latin to block the path. She gathered followers, admirers, spies. One of them whispered her name into the wrong ear, and that whisper became a summons. She was arrested once, then freed, arrested again. And this time, they meant to break her. She was taken to the Tower of London, where she was interrogated by men who did not ask questions to understand, but to destroy. They wanted names, women who believed as she did, nobles who shared her books, perhaps even Queen Catherine Parr, who had been known to favor the same scripture. But Anne said nothing. She smiled. She prayed. And then, when silence did not serve their purpose, they led her to the rack. No woman had ever been racked in the Tower of London. The law forbade it. The custom abhorred it. But customs meant nothing when the king turned his face away. She was stripped to her shift, tied down, stretched until her joints burst and her tendons tore. She passed out once, then twice, when the torturer refused to continue, saying he had seen enough. Two of the king's men took over with their own hands, Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich, twisting the handles while Anne's body opened like paper beneath them. She did not scream. She did not give names. She did not beg. She could no longer walk. Her spine curved where it once stood tall. Her wrists hung useless. Her legs trembled and failed. When they lifted her from the rack, she could not even raise her arms to bless herself. But still she would not recant. And so, they condemned her to burning. The execution was set for July the 16th. In the year 1546, they brought her to Smithfield in a cart. Seated, broken, carried like a doll with its joints undone. She could not climb the scaffold, could not stand. So they sat her in a chair, chained her to it, surrounded her with wood, and still she preached, her voice quiet, but steady, her body ruined, but her faith untouched. Someone took pity on her, slipped gunpowder into the pile, hoping the end would come quickly. Others watched with dry eyes. The fire was lit, the smoke curled, and Anne Askew began to burn. Some say it lasted an hour, that her bones cracked like dry branches, that her skin peeled and lifted in sheets, that she never screamed. Others say the gunpowder caught, and she vanished in a single thunderclap. But one thing is always written, that she died with her head tilted toward heaven, and her lips still moving in prayer. Her ashes were swept away. Her name was nearly forgotten. But she left behind something far heavier than bones. She left behind a book, dictated in the Tower, smuggled out, published after her death. It was called The Examinations, and in it, she wrote, "They did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlemen to be of my opinion. The Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands till I was nigh dead. I would rather die than break my faith." And so she did. The Queen was spared. No one else was named. And in her silence, Anne Askew protected more than herself. She protected a movement, a belief, a truth that refused to bow to iron or flame. She was only 25. And now, as you drift into sleep, imagine her not in fire, not in chains, but in the chapel she dreamed of, her body whole again, her voice rising through the silence. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not yield. And when the wind blew through Smithfield that night, carrying ash into alleyways and windows, it did not carry sorrow. It carried light. She had once been the most dazzling woman in England, sharp of wit, dark of eyes, unpredictable, untouchable, a flame that lured the king himself away from wife and church in Rome. She had danced through the halls of Hampton Court like a woman who feared nothing and loved no one but the crown that was promised. She had waited 7 years for her wedding day, had risked all for the child that kicked beneath her ribs. And in the end, she had been Queen of England for barely 3 years before the whispers grew teeth. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And on the morning of May the 19th, in the year 1536, She stepped onto a wooden scaffold and smiled. The girl who had once smiled at Henry across the chessboard now smiled at death. Her fall had not come suddenly. It had come like fog over the Thames. Slow and soft. Until no one could see clearly. There had been no great rebellion. No dagger in the dark. Only accusations. Lies. Dressed in velvet and signed in blood. They said she had seduced 5 men. They said she had plotted to kill the king. They said she had slept with her own brother. And all of it, every word had been said with enough certainty to fill the tower with silence. The men had died first. Mark Smeaton, the musician who confessed under torture. Henry Norris, the friend who stayed too long. Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn, her brother, who laughed at the charges and was still beheaded anyway. Anne had watched the towers of the fortress grow darker with every day. She had walked from cell to chapel. She had prayed. She had wept. She had waited. She had once been so sure of herself. But now she dressed in gray and red, the colors of penance and martyrdom. She wrote letters. She pleaded her innocence. She forgave the king. She spoke to her chaplain. She practiced kneeling, not because she had accepted death, but because there was nothing else left to do. And still, she smiled. The night before her execution, she could not sleep. They postponed it twice. Once because the scaffold had not yet been built, and once because someone had whispered that the people outside the tower had begun to murmur, had begun to ask whether the queen might be innocent. Perhaps, in those hours of delay, she believed the king would change his mind. Perhaps she thought he might ride to her door, cloak in wind, crown in hand, and say he had been wrong. But he did not come. Instead, he sent a swordsman from France, an executioner trained not in brute axes, but in swift, clean kills. The gesture, they said, was mercy. But the truth was colder. The swordsman had been summoned 6 days before her trial began. Her death had been scheduled before her guilt had even been invented. And so the morning came. 5 o'clock. And Anne was dressed by her women. She wore an undergown of crimson, the color of martyrs, and a gray gown above it. Her dark hair tucked beneath a linen coif. She carried a prayer book. She walked slowly, flanked by guards, past the White Tower, past the chapel where she would soon be laid. When she reached the scaffold, she paused, then climbed, then turned to face the crowd. They said she looked beautiful. The sun had not yet burned through the clouds. The air was damp. The wood beneath her feet creaked. She looked out and saw not enemies. Bu silence courtier. Soldiers. Ambassadors. And at the edge, Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, watching with blank eyes. And still she smiled. She asked permission to speak. And when it was given, she said only this: "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. I am not here to accuse any man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor more merciful prince was there never and to me, he was ever a good and gracious lord." Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She did not curse the men who had condemned her, nor the women who had gossiped, nor the husband who had betrayed her. She only spoke of God, of mercy, of her daughter Elizabeth, whom she would never see again. Then she knelt. The swordsman removed his shoes, so she would not hear him approach. Her ladies tied the cloth around her eyes. She said to Jesus Christ, "I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." The sword was hidden in the straw. The signal was given. And with one clean stroke, her head was severed from her body. The lips, they said, moved for several moments after fun. The blood soaked the wood. The executioner held her head aloft, then lowered it gently, her women sobbing. Bare-handed lifted her body and wrapped it in linen. There had been no coffin prepared. The tower's armorers found an arrow chest and placed her body inside. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, not far from her brother. No tomb was carved. No stone was placed. 3 hours later, Henry dressed in white and rode to Jane Seymour, the woman who would become his third wife. The cannons fired, not in mourning, but to mark that the king was free. Anne Boleyn's portraits were scraped from walls, her initials burned from windows, her symbols defaced, her daughter declared illegitimate, her name Iracid. But history remembered, and more than 2 decades later, her daughter Elizabeth, once a bastard, became queen. She ruled for 44 years, never married, and never forgot. She wore a ring, hidden from the world, with 2 portraits inside, one of herself, and one of Anne, a daughter and a mother, a queen and a ghost, and the ring was removed only upon her death. Anne's smile, that final one on the scaffold, lives still, not in fear, but in defiance. She died with dignity, with courage, with the sharp clarity of a woman who had once ruled hearts and nations, and who in the final moment refused to flinch. So if you dream tonight, let it be of her not on her knees, but dancing, crowned, laughing in a hall lit by candlelight, a woman who rose, who fell, and who still refuses to vanish. She was little more than a girl when she wore the crown, no more than 15 or 16 when her name was whispered through the halls of court as the king's new desire, and barely 18 when the doors of the tower closed behind her for the last time. Her name was Catherine Howard, and though history remembers her as the 5th wife of Henry VIII, her story is not one of royalty or romance, but of silence, in fear, and a voice too young to be heard until it was too late. She came to court smiling, flirtatious, called the rose without a thorn. But in the end, she was just a child in a palace of predators, and when the axe fell, it did not fall on a queen, but on a girl who had never been taught how to survive. She had been raised not in gold, but in shadow, placed in the care of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where young girls were often left unsupervised, where music tutors became lovers, and where no one stopped to ask whether affection had been consented to or coerced. Catherine was barely more than a child when Francis Dereham, a charming man with ambition and darkness, began to visit her bed at night. Later, she would say she thought they were betrothed. Later, he would say she had promised him nothing. But by the time she arrived at court, her past had already marked her. And then came Henry, bloated, infected, wrapped in layers of silk to hide the stench of his leg. But still the king, still hungry for a wife who could restore his youth. He saw Catherine, saw her youth, her beauty, her laughter, and decided she would be queen. It was not a question. It was not a request. She was lifted from lady and waiting to wife, placed beside him as a jewel, expected to be grateful. She was crowned. She smiled, She kissed him on the cheek, but he was 30 years her senior, and she had never loved him. He wrote her poems, called her his blushing rose. She called him my sovereign lord. And when she lay beside him, she smiled with lips that did not tremble. But inside, she was alone. The court watched. The courtiers whispered, and when she turned her eyes toward Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber, the seeds of her end were sown. He was handsome, closer to her age, perhaps kind, perhaps only bold. They met in secret. A lady-in-waiting arranged it, Jane Boleyn, the sister-in-law of the late Anne. Perhaps there was more than talk. Perhaps not. But the Tower does not require proof, only suggestion. The past caught up with her first. Francis Dereham returned, seeking a position. He bragged, boasted, and soon, the king was told that his queen had not come to him untouched. The court turned. Investigations were opened. Her past lovers were questioned. Letters were found. Names were named. Confessions whispered under pressure. And the girl who once giggled behind fans now sat pale and shivering in a stone room. Her hands clenched. Her voice too soft to defend herself. She was stripped of her titles, declared guilty of treason, and on the 10th of February, in the year 1542, she was taken by boat to the Tower, past London Bridge, where the heads of Dereham and Culpeper had been freshly mounted on spikes, their blood still drying in the wind. She saw them, and she screamed. For 3 days, she waited in a chamber, once meant for queens. She knew what was coming. She prayed. She wept. She asked for the block to be brought to her, so that she could practice laying her head down. The request was granted, and so, the night before she died, Catherine Howard knelt again and again, learning how to die with grace. They came for her at dawn. The scaffold had been raised on Tower Green, the same quiet corner where Anne Boleyn had stood. The crowd was smaller this time, more solemn. Fewer faces smiled. Catherine wore a simple gown, pale bleu. Some say, her hair pinned beneath a white coif. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs trembling, her breath short. She turned to the crowd, her voice little more than a whisper. She confessed her sins, begged forgiveness, and then, though no record proves it, one chronicler swore she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Thomas Culpeper." And then she knelt. The axe was raised. The crowd fell silent, and in a single blow, her head fell to the straw. The executioner held it up. A black cloth was thrown over her body. She was taken to St. Peter ad Vincula, buried beside the other queens who had died for a crown, Anne Boleyn, Jane Boleyn. Now, Catherine. She had ruled for less than 2 years. She had loved. Perhaps. Lied. Perhaps. But she had never been taught to survive a court that only valued women when they were obedient, silent, and useful. And when she ceased to be those things, they sent her back through the same gates she had once entered as a queen, only this time, to die, tonight. As you lie in the dark, think of her not with pity, but with understanding. She was not wicked. She was not stupid. She was not unfaithful by nature. She was a girl, caught in a palace that consumed the young, the beautiful, the hopeful, and when her heart beat its last, it did not do so in disgrace, it did so in defiance. Because even in death, Catherine Howard chose her own last words. Let it end not with an axe, nor a flame, nor a scream swallowed by stone. Let it end with breath soft, slow, steady, like the hush of footsteps retreating down a candlelit corridor, like the last wave of a mourning bell, long after the mourners have gone. Let it end the way their lives did not. Quiet, gentle, seen. This is a lullaby for the women who died beneath Henry VIII, for the queens and the servants, for the lovers and the heretics, for the mothers, the girls, the ghosts, for Anne Boleyn, who smiled with her neck bare and her faith intact, for Catherine Howard, who practiced how to die before she was old enough to know how to live, for Margaret Pole, who stood defiant even as the blade fell again and again, for Elizabeth Barton, who spoke with the voice of God and then was forced to swallow her own words, for Anne Askew, who did not scream even when her body broke, for Margaret Davy, whose skin was boiled from her bones while the crowd watched in stunned silence, for Alice Wolfe, who tried to escape and drowned slowly while the tide came in, for Jane Boleyn, who knew too much, said too little, and died with history's blame sewn into her shroud. But not only for them, this is also for the ones we do not name, for the girls who died in childbirth because a midwife was accused of witchcraft, for the widows who starved after their husbands were executed, for the nuns driven from their abbeys, their hands still smelling of wax and bread and old paper, their rosaries burned, their prayers forbidden, for the women who were never queens, never rebels, never seen, the ones whose stories were never recorded, because their lives were not considered valuable enough to ruin, because Henry's England, for all its splendor, Ibonke, its golden goblets and marble corridors, was built not only on conquest, but on silence, and the silence was deepest around women. They were praised when obedient, tolerated when beautiful, and destroyed when inconvenient. A queen who could not bear sons, a wife who spoke too loudly, a servant who moved through shadows, a mother whose son dared speak against the throne. The axe was always ready. The fire was always lit. The tower door was never truly closed. And yet they endured. In whispers, in memories, in the uneasy dreams of those who carried the crown after them. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, ruled longer than any Tudor. And she never forgot. She did not weep publicly, but she wore a ring with her mother's face inside it, hidden, always near her skin. The church named Margaret Pole a martyr. Protestants still speak of Anne Askew in reverent tones. But it is not enough, because even now, Century la Terre, we still struggle to say their names with the tenderness they deserved. We remember the kings, the wars, the treaties, the battles, but the women, they are remembered in execution dates, not in stories. They are remembered for the way they died, not the way they lived. So let this final chapter be a prayer, a soft one, a long one, a story without judgment, only light. Imagine them now, not as they were on the scaffold, but before. Margaret Pole walking through a garden with her grandchildren, teaching them Latin from memory. Anne Boleyn laughing as a child in Hever Castle. Hair loose. Her future still hers. Catherine Howard picking flowers and humming under her breath, unaware that one day her voice would be taken from her. Elizabeth Barton kneeling alone in a chapel, not speaking prophecies, just listening. Anne Askew writing by candlelight, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she knew. Alice Wolfe brushing her hair in a prison mirror, still believing escape was possible. Jane Boleyn sitting in the corner of a room too large for her thoughts, wondering when the world had stopped loving clever women. They are not statistics. They are not relics. They are not cautionary tales. They were real. They were warm. They were tired. They were brave. And they should have grown old. So sleep now. Let the fires die out. Let the swords rust. Let the tower stand in silence, holding no more secrets. Tonight, there are no trials, no betrayals, no sermons, only quiet, only wind brushing the stones where their names were once scratched, only the hum of history remembering what it tried to forget. And if you wake in the dark and hear nothing at all, that's not emptiness, that's peace. Because the kingdom that once buried these women in fear now keeps them in memory. And memory, at last, does not forget.